Hey everybody, welcome to Dad's Den of Pop Culture. I have been on a jag lately of British action adventure shows from the 60s, from the 70s. Mostly ones that I'd never seen before, often had never heard of before. One of those in particular being The Champions, which is what I'm going to talk about today. Typically I like to review shows that I like. So I don't like to put a lot of negative reviews out there. And this is not exactly going to be a negative review. I didn't hate this show. But I would probably give it like a grade of C. It's sort of right in the middle there. But I think there's some reasons why it doesn't get a higher grade from me. And I thought it might be kind of interesting to talk about that a little bit in the context of the show. But first, let's talk about what the show actually is. So we're talking about espionage, sort of a spy show, but with a little bit of a supernatural fantasy edge to it. And in fact, I think that's actually one of the problems the show has. It stars Stuart Damon as Craig Sterling, a pilot, William Gaunt as Richard Barrett, a codebreaker, and Alexandra Bastedo as Sharon McCready, who is a scientist. They work for a group called Nemesis, that's like an international peacekeeping agency. I guess kind of like S.H.I.E.L.D. in Marvel, but without the snappy costumes. And on a particular mission, these operatives, I guess that's the best way to put them, are spying in communist China, and they're fleeing in an airplane, and the airplane is brought down in the Himalayas, and they are discovered by people from Shangri-La who save their lives and give them extraordinary powers. Sort of a kind of an ESP that allows them to maybe glimpse danger or potential danger. They can sort of telepathically communicate with one another. Their senses are heightened. Their sort of peak physical strength and speed of human beings. So they're not given like massive superpowers, but they are superior to other people. So all this happens in China. They manage to complete their mission because of these special abilities that they have. And they return back to work for W.L. Tremaine, played by Anthony Nichols. And Nichols is unaware, I should say Tremaine is unaware of their special abilities. And so they operate as the champions, protecting people, blah, 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 blah. All right. So where's the problems with the show? Because it has some definite talent behind it. The actors are fine. Alexandra Bastedo, a little bit cold for me. I think I like Stuart Damon the best. He came off as the most charismatic to me. I also happen to remember him from a soap opera that my mom used to watch called General Hospital, where he played Alan Quartermain. In fact, that's the first thing that hit me when I saw the show. It's like, oh my God, it's Dr. Quartermain. But acting-wise, it's fine. It's not spectacular, but it's fine. It's decent. It's good. You got folks behind it who worked on the Avengers, Danger Man, a lot of great espionage sort of action shows out of the UK. And the plots, again, are fine. You know, they're not bad. You're not watching any of this and coming away going, oh, this is terrible. This is awful. They don't know what they're doing. But it's all only just fine. And I think there's two primary reasons for this. The first is that their special abilities are never really countered by special abilities of anyone else. So it's kind of like early Superman comic strips where he's beating up on gangsters. And there's a certain power fantasy in that. It's fun to see bad guys get knocked around by Superman. But it doesn't stay interesting forever. And at some point, they had to find ways to challenge him, to sort of negate the powers, or force him to use the powers creatively to get through situations. Now, there's a little bit of that in this. That's not completely absent. But generally speaking, the folks they're going up against are unaware of their powers. Hey, their boss is unaware of their powers. And so they're not like prepared for them. So you sort of have superheroes versus normal people. And I found that oftentimes they'll be holding back on the powers a little bit to get themselves, inside an organization to they'll allow themselves to be captured. And when it comes down to it, then pop, out go the powers, and they take out the bad guys, and that's it. And it never struck me of like that it was particularly creative the way it was done, or that there was any particular tension. Just sort of happens. Now, there's another older show I've been watching, also out of the UK, called The Invisible Man. Now, you have the same kind of situation. You have this operative, and in this show, it's a guy named Peter Brady. It's kind of funny. And he's known to be the Invisible Man. People out in the public know this. And so he'll get involved in these adventures, crime, espionage, things like this. And obviously use his invisibility to get through it. But there is the potential that the bad guys will realize what's going on. And I think, to me, they find a much more interesting way to use that invisibility. It gives him an edge, but it doesn't just seem like a Deus Ex Machina to get through the plot. I'm going to review that show at some point. I'm enjoying it, and it surprised me a little that I enjoyed it. So the gimmick of this show, the super abilities, I don't feel like they really add to the show. In fact, I think if you took them away and had these three just working as agents with their own unique abilities, pilot, code breaker, scientist, what have you, they might have been more interesting, actually. Like the Avengers, where you have two characters who are obviously above the norm, but don't have powers per se. Of course, I'm talking about the British TV show, The Avengers, not the comic book. Danger Man, things like that. So I think that's one of the issues that the show had for me. I just didn't feel like the powers were adding anything to it. And in fact, were to some degree making the plots a little less interesting, taking some of the tension away. But I think the bigger problem is characterization, in as much as the show has very little of it. Over the 30 episodes that were filmed, you really don't learn anything about who these people are outside of their work for Nemesis. You might get a little glimpse here and there, but not much. And I think that's a serious problem for a show like this. You have a show about all of these amazing plots by interesting or somewhat interesting villains. And sometimes on paper, the stakes are there. One of the later episodes involves Nazis trying to recover an atomic bomb that the Nazis had actually invented right before the end of World War II, and that was lost. And their plan is to set it off between the border, essentially, of West and East Germany to create a war between the U.S. and the Soviet Union that they, I guess, think they're going to somehow get out, take power because of this war. It's not a great plan, to be honest with you. Okay, well, there's stakes. A nuclear explosion. It's going to kill a lot of people. It could start World War III. But it's fictional. It's all fictional. A lot of people fall into the idea that these kind of plots are interesting in and of themselves. Sometimes they can be clever, but they're not particularly interesting because they're all fictional. They're make-believe. There are no real stakes whatsoever. You have to simulate the stakes to create the tension to make these things interesting. It's why the original Star Wars movies are pretty good. They have a plot to them, but the plot is made interesting because of the characters and us sort of getting to know them and getting to like them, and therefore feeling the danger through them. It makes it personal. Later Star Wars films are more about the plot. They're movies about Star Wars. And they lose some of that character, and therefore you just don't really care as much. Think about every day, a lot of people die. Natural causes, what have you. We all know this. And newspapers have obituaries. And you may read one of those at some point and you go, oh, it's too bad. Doesn't really impact you because you don't know who these people are. And you don't find out enough in an obituary to get to know them. In the meantime, a celebrity dies and we're all out there, oh, this is terrible, rest in peace, etc. Why? Because we felt like, in a way, we knew them. Now, the fact of the matter is that celebrity really is as much a stranger to us as some other person who just passed away of natural causes in some city in the U.S. or elsewhere. We don't really know these people. I mean, a few people do, but most of us don't. And yet you feel it a little more keen. So I think when you're doing shows like this, you need to make the characters accessible to the audience. There needs to be at least some feeling of intimacy. You need to like them a bit. Now, sometimes you can do this just with very charismatic actors. Roger Moore is a good example of that. Sean Connery, both of them as James Bond. You don't necessarily know a lot about Bond's life, but the charisma of the actors makes you interested in them. But if you look at this picture over here, Damon's smiling, and Damon does have some charisma for sure. The other two are so reserved that I don't feel like you quite get that charisma from them. Now, they're not always completely reserved. They're not. But it's not enough. It's not Roger Moore and the Saint. It's not enough charisma just to make it off of that alone. We just don't find out any real thing about their lives and who they are. Or is there anybody they're interested in? Are there any relationships between the two of them? Think about the Avengers with Steed and Peel. There's the flirting between them, right? That kind of endears them to you. Even Dragnet, which was notoriously dry and trying to be dry, you still found out details about Gannon's, life, as his wife and such. Sometimes even little glimpses into Joe Friday, although not much. And that helps. But I feel like here you just didn't get enough of that. And so you're left with these plots that, okay, on paper, there are stakes, but gee, you kind of think that at the end, the good guys are going to win. And it's not a puzzle how they're going to win. They're going to do it with their special abilities from Shangri-La. And you don't necessarily feel much tension because you barely know who these people are. And so I think that's why I give the show ultimately kind of a grade of C. It's competent. It's done well. The dialogue's fine. Everything in it is fine. But it's lacking those two ingredients that I think would have made it a much better show and a much more engaging show. Now, I will say there was one episode in particular that stood out to me. And I think this is it's an example in some ways of the good and the bad that you get in this show. It's episode 18. It's called The Interrogation. Craig is captured after a mission in Hong Kong, and he's held in a cell where he's subject to interrogation by various means. And they're trying to get details about his last mission. He's trying not to give them. And I know I'm not going to spoil how the episode ends, but it has emotional impact. It was the only episode that had emotional impact to me. I think it's interesting that it was Stuart Damon who was in it, primarily as the focus of it. Now, apparently, the episode was intended as a season finale. And it sets up some potentially interesting relationships between the characters and between the characters and Tremaine. And it's never referenced again. Right back to business as usual afterwards. That's not great. It's almost like, oh, we almost got some insight into these characters and who they are and got some emotion. Quick, let's run the other way. So that's The Champions. I guess this is a negative review, although again, I'm not saying that this is a terrible show, and there are probably people who loved it quite a bit at its time. I could see definitely as a kid totally digging this thing. I mean, like look at something like Knight Rider, you know. Kids have that power fantasy and it works for them repetitively. But as an adult, I don't watch a lot of Knight Rider. And as an adult watching Champions, I found that the other British shows of its kind that I was watching, I much more looked forward to watching an episode every week, and I found them much more endearing, and it was almost entirely because of the characterizations and having that connection with the characters that makes the entire thing a little more, well, it creates the stakes, that creates the tension that makes you wonder if they're going to survive and how they're going to survive. So there it is, folks. The Champions, a decent show, but in my opinion, not a great show. And it probably could have been a great show if they had actually put a little character work into these three. So what do you think? Is this a show that you remember from your childhood? A show that you really liked? Is it a show that maybe you had some problems with as well? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear them, and I will answer back the best I can and when I can. If you enjoyed this review, please give this video a like. I would really appreciate that. If you enjoy pop culture videos, you might want to subscribe to my channel. I do about 3 videos a week. I cover various topics, stretching back, well, so far stretching back to the 1930s. I'll probably go even further back than that at some point. There's a couple silent movies I'd really like to review. I just haven't quite gotten to it yet. So maybe subscribe if you like that kind of thing. Maybe share with a friend. It all helps my channel, and I would really, really appreciate it. So until the next video, God bless everybody. Please be kind to one another and try to have some fun. And maybe I'll see you next time in Dad's Den of Pop Culture. Bye-bye.